say so. It's always interesting and thought-provoking.
Well, with that, I will move right along. This talk is basically in about 3 parts. An update on Tokitae, as I've learned to pronounce it. I think we can learn a lot from her, and there's a lot about the campaign. In fact, there's some big new news of just the last couple of days. Could be a major breakthrough, and so I'll share that with you. And also the Southern residents, basically how they're doing, what we know, what's recent current information. And then try to just grapple with this idea of how do they feel their grief? How do they show it and express it? I think, well, I'll go on. Who knows where I may go with this? In the last 5 or 6 years, there have been many cases, and there are still ongoing legal cases to bring her home. It's all oriented toward returning her to a protected sea pen in the San Juan Islands for rehabilitation, to regain her strength and stamina, and to be able to swim free and hopefully at some point rejoin her family if that is how she and they choose. So in 2011, this was sort of the shot across the bow. There was a lawsuit against SeaWorld, not concerning directly her, but it sort of established in the public mind that that they are persons, that they have rights, that they shouldn't be held captive in involuntary servitude for anyone's entertainment money. So it was dismissed, but it sort of made that point. And then there was a petition to the Fisheries Service to include her as a member of her family under the ESA. That was in 2012. In 2013, there was a case against the USDA to void the license that is granted to the owners every year, despite these multiple egregious violations of the Animal Welfare Act that the USDA is supposed to administer. So that has been a sort of an ongoing case. That was dismissed in June of 2015, but also in 2015 on a sort of a separate track. There were some legal efforts that resulted in OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, cracking down, citing the seaquarium for endangering trainers because they didn't know what Toki might do. They saw what happened at SeaWorld. And so the seaquarium at first appealed, and I think then they thought about what happened when SeaWorld appealed their OSHA citation, and that became the tastiest morsel out of the movie Blackfish. So they didn't want to see that happen to them, so they didn't appeal. They dropped their appeal, so now there is no more waterwork. In May of 2015, finally that petition, after 3 years, was accepted. She became a member of her family under the ESA. And in 2015, our case, right after that, within weeks, we filed a case against the seaquarium for violations of the Endangered Species Act. So those 2 cases are still pending and are overripe right now. They're over a year waiting for the case against the USDA for a ruling and for on the appeal. And in the case of the ESA, it's also an appeal of a dismissal, and so we're waiting on that. And again, those all hinge on the illegality of the tank. So I think that we've had the law on our side, and we've known this. We've known it, unofficially for over 20 years. The tank was illegal. The lawyers have been filing papers to that effect for over 5 years, constantly repeating the tank is illegal. She is solo, and that's illegal. She is subject to the midday Miami sun. That's illegal. There are other violations too. But they just don't want to shut down a marine park. They don't want to be the first judge that shuts down a marine park and opens that can of worms. What do you do with the whale? So they just didn't want to do it. But meanwhile, we are changing society. I think we have really won in the court of public opinion. The attitudes have changed, and it's showing up in the decreasing revenues at the park and the increasing negative publicity. There is a lawsuit pending right now, and it's gaining momentum. It was granted the appearance. It wasn't blocked, in other words. It's going forward against SeaWorld for misleading investors in 2013 because they said, well, our decrease in revenues is because it was Easter or because it rained. And they knew, everybody knew that it was because people were suddenly aware of the essentially mistreatment, inherent mistreatment, regardless of their intentions. The captivity condition itself is mistreatment of the orcas. And everybody was realizing that. It was in the movie Blackfish. I mean, it's funny because every time there's any kind of story about SeaWorld, and they're all about downturns, about their economic problems, to this day, 5 years later, they relate back to it started with Blackfish. It's still the Blackfish effect. So it's been a very effective film. So now we have this. This happened Wednesday. For the first time ever, the Inspector General of the USDA, you know, they're sort of the independent watchdogs. Every agency has them, and they're very solid. And they came out with a finding just Wednesday. Not only is the tank too small and she's solo and subject to the sun, but they even found some other violations. Like there's just a little 4-foot fence around the pool and people can lean over and they can drop things. That's illegal. You're supposed to have a big wall. Anyway, a lot of violations. And so now it's official. It's public. I don't see how a court can deny that. I mean, they've been shucking and jiving and pretending and being vague and avoiding the issue all these years. They cannot do that anymore. It's from their own Inspector General now. So these two cases still pending. I think the prospect just shifted big time. And this is that lawsuit. I just told you about that. But this is the lawsuit by the investors for misleading the public. So that's the Toki news, and we can talk more about that, but I'm trying to roll on here. So I'm going to move on to the southern residents and how are they doing. And the short story is that since last fall, only J-Pod and on one occasion K-Pod have shown up to be counted. There is no monitoring out in the ocean. Some years there is, and there was the radio tagging, and there have been research cruises by the fisheries service, but that's not going on this year. They have some sort of stationary hydrophones, but they won't be collected until late summer, if then. And then they have to be analyzed, and they'll try to find if there were southern residents off the Columbia River, which we are pretty sure is where they are, but there's no data, no evidence, nobody really knows. So all we have are when they come into the Salish Sea, in Sri-Lanka, and wherever they may go, Puget Sound or northward. And K's came in with J-Pod on February 16th last. And Jays were all there, and they were way spread out. The only one that was not seen and photographed of K-Pod was K-13, but chances are she was there. That's not an alarm. Also, L-87 was not seen that day, and he's always with J-Pod for the last many years. So he's a sort of honorary adoptee of J-Pod. So Anyway, nobody's worried about K-13, even though she wasn't seen that day. But what I want to do is just give you a couple of stories, kind of, you know, personalize it and give you a sense of what is seen out there, what it's like to do the research. You can all see the graph. I don't really have to point that out. This is, you know, every year in end of December, the numbers, and so you can see they're not growing. And there's been a recent downturn despite the baby boom of 2015. They have more than eliminated those gains. And in fact, there have been 7 known whales and 3 neonate fatalities in 2016 for a total of 10 southern residents lost in 2016. But what I want to do is show you how we know that. Show you just a little bit about how the research is done. And fortuitously, this was yesterday. This was a whale reporter. These are transients. That's T-170. There were, by some reports, 24 transients in Harrow Strait, Boundary Pass, Georgia Strait, sort of in groups, but more or less in one long group. And there were Ken Balcom and Dave Ellifrit doing what they do, what they've done, Ken since the mid-1970s, Dave since the late 1980s, in the boat called Orcas. So I just want to read a little bit about their encounters. They're all on the web. You can find these with amazing photos. Each encounter has a half a dozen or so of their beautiful, beautiful photos. And they tell these stories. So, the most recent, May 28th. The start time, 1938. That's 7:38 for us land lovers. End time, 20:08, which means 30 minutes out on the water. J-Pod and L-87 in Harrow Strait. We arrived on scene off the south end of Kellett Bluff at 1938. J-Pod and L-87 were in arresting formation. So this kind of describes that. I don't know if you have heard that term, but arresting formation is when they group up. In fact, they kind of are side by side. It's not a perfect choreographed line, but more or less. And they're in their matriline arrangements pretty much. The mother, her offspring, and their offspring are sort of arrayed around the elder female. And they are up on the surface for 12 or 15 breaths over the course of about 3 minutes. And then they're down, but not very far. They're still cruising at the same very slow 2 or 3 knots. And same direction, same formation, for about another 2 or 3 minutes, and then they surface and breathe 10 or 12 times and then down. So this was the scene that they saw. They're in a resting formation with all the whales being in one tight group, moving very slowly north with the tide. We left the whales heading north up Harrow Strait off Kellett Bluff at 20:08 in one tight, slow-moving group. All members of J-Pod and L-87 were photographed. This is got to be the easiest encounter of complete documentation of the entire pod ever. Because when they're in that kind of row and they're coming up, you've got your motor drive, and they've got 2 cameras usually. And so they just snap, 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 probably, 8 per second, and just get them all. And they're also visually identifying each one. So that encounter only took a half an hour to get them all. Okay, before that was May 13th. Observer was Ken Balcom. And that just documented, I'm not reading the whole encounter report, but all of J-Pod and L-87 appeared to be in good condition during this visit, or at least none appeared to be in poor condition. So this is really quite amazing, actually. Unexpected anyway by me. because over the last 3 or 4 years, J-pod, contrary to the previous 30 years, began to fragment, break up into, they called it Group A and Group B. There wasn't really consistent of exactly who was in each group, but sometimes into macrolines. Just the J16s would appear for a few days at a time. Where's the rest of J-pod? So I sort of expected that there would be more of that, maybe even worse this year, for 2 reasons. One is everything we're hearing about salmon numbers is scary off the coast. Record lows of counts at Bonneville Dam and the other dams. And so we thought, well, they're going to be even more desperate to find food, because the theory is they have to split up and fan out and cover every nook and cranny and, you know, just forget socializing, forget being a pod, because they've each got to find some food. Of course, they don't lose touch with each other, and they share their food, and they don't really lose their membership and their cohesion as a pod, but they may be miles and miles and miles apart. But not that day. All of them appear to be in good condition, so that's the last 2 encounters. And then before that, May 7th, again, Arrow Strait in Juan de Fuca, J-pod, and L87, all of them accounted for. March 19th, observers Mark Mallison, Gord Rowles on Hind Bank, which is south of San Juan Island. This is just sort of to give you a little scenario, a little picture of what the research is like. We confirmed it was J-pod and that they were in a resting formation of 15 or 16 individuals, including the J22s, J19s, J11s, J17, J46, and J53. We slowly worked our way to the south and came across J16, J50, and J42. We saw what looked like J36 and J52, but didn't have an opportunity to photograph them. Further to the south, I spotted a couple of bulls on the horizon, separated by a half-mile or more. I was able to photograph J26. We confirmed sighting L87. So they're out there looking for individuals. That's how the demographic photo identification work is basically done. You document each individual, each encounter. That's why this is the most thoroughly documented and the only population of whales that every individual has been documented every year since 1976. So then you go back to February 18th, J-pod in L87, Dave Belfry, out there by himself in that boat right there, Orcas. A first quick photo of a distant whale turned out to be J16. The first group to file by Orcas was J19, J39, and J51. J39 did several dorsal fin slaps. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's hilarious. The whales do a barrel roll, but real quick, and slap their dorsal fin horizontally on the water, making a clapping sound. Let's see, J41 was following and soon joined J19 and J51 as they traveled south into Mitchell Bay. J36 snuck by unphotographed. This is the jargon. Anyway, snuck by. There was a larger loose group a little offshore that included all the J14s along with J27 and J31. This group moved to the mid-strait area off the south end of Henry Island, where they all engaged together in an active chase of one or more salmon. A quarter-mile west of the fish chasing group were J26 and J16 heading south, spread out. West of J26, J22 was seen and photographed, while another bull was seen west of her. So it's sometimes one at a time, and you try to get a picture of one and then scan the horizon and way off a half a mile or a mile, maybe another. About a quarter mile to the north of L87 is J38, and the beeline for Seabird Point, which is east of Victoria. So before that, and the only time K-Pod was seen, and we were with J-Pod, February 16th, Dave Elliford again. And this is, it's almost frustrating when you sort of imagine trying to photograph all the whales. Dave found his first whale about a mile west of the Center for Whale Research at 11:55. This was J39. As J39 headed north, other whales started appearing, but they were very spread out. The next whale seen was K12, and then K37, and K43, all three traveling or foraging by themselves. K22 and K33 were seen next, and they were also loosely spread out as they traveled north about a mile or so offshore mid-Andrews Bay, that's on San Juan Island. The pair tightened up a little later. K14 and K26 were seen together inshore of and behind the K22s. So it goes on, one whale at a time, pretty much, and then another mile or so. A little to the northwest of the K13s was another tight group of three, and this was K16, K35, and K21. The group soon turned north with a bit more of an angle across the strait towards Stewart Island. Upon turning the boat around for home, they'd given up. A few more spread out whales could be seen way over on the Canadian side of the strait. A quick picture of a backlit juvenile revealed J47, so that might have been where some of the J17s had been hiding. That's how it goes. Since daylight was fading, Orcinus headed south toward home. At 17:05, between Battleship Rock and Pellet Bluff, Dave spotted a bull who turned out to be J26. J26 grew slowly north, and Orcinus left him at 17:15 off Battleship Rock. The only two whales we could not find were K13 and L87. That was that day. And they were very spread out. So that sort of gives you a sense of what we know and how we know it. That's how the research has been done. I was privileged to be able to be part of that back in the early 80s, 81, 82 summer field seasons out every day, all summer, just traipsing along with the whales. And, you know, doing the photo documentation and getting to know them, because you really do get an intimate look at them. You see them in their normal, typical day in the life, when they're just traveling, they're socializing, you're out there. If you're lucky, it's only a half hour, but it can be hours and hours, especially during long summer days. So you really get to see their changes, their behavior changes that you have to wonder, how are they so coordinated? They can be moving all in one direction, all spread out, and then they disappear for 10, 15 minutes, and then they're all grouped up and go in a different direction. And, you know, so they are all always traveling in a harmonious, coordinated group. They're all tuned into each other all the time. So now, I want to talk a little bit about the losses, just to give you sort of a preview. We miss them. J2, J34, J2 Granny, J34 double stuff, J28 Polaris, J54 Dipper, J14 Samish, J19 Nigel, and J55 unknown gender, unknown mother. Could have been either J14, J37, or J40, but missing after just a few weeks of life. We feel this loss. They're important to us. We love them, and we miss them. When they're gone, we feel the lack of them. because we're joyful when we see them. And we look forward to seeing them again. They kind of make our day. It's something to share. And so when we lose them, it's sad. But how are we to even begin to understand their grief? How can we know? It's very hard to say. Let's just sort of look at a few of them, at all of them, in fact, that we've lost. J2 Granny, that's Center for Widow Research, OID. And I had to put this in as Sarah Haisong Shimazu's beautiful graphic artwork of J2. And also this of J2 and J1. They were very often together, very tight like this. But J1 died in 2010. And now we have L87 in pretty much the same position. And we know from Mike Ford, contrary to all appearances, J1 was not J2's son, after all. So, you know, as long as the research had been going on, they were pretty much together. But something happened before that, and they adopted each other. And this is a Northwest Fisheries Science Center shot from a hexacopter drone showing J2 Granny just before she died, just a few weeks. And it's pretty hard to tell in that slide, but there's a salmon in front of J2, and the subsequent photos showed that she grabbed the salmon and gave it to her great-grandson, J45. And she was not in good shape. She was obviously very stressed out right then and underweight. That shows you a bit of the family loyalty that they have. And J34 double stuff. And this photo, in fact, was taken just a few days before he washed up on a beach north of Vancouver. Still not clear what killed him. Blunt force trauma, but I haven't seen any clarifying necropsy results to show more kind of evidence. Blunt force by ship strike usually means broken bones, or at least some localization of where the strike was, and we haven't seen that. So it's still a mystery what killed J34. And this is J34 with her mom in Edmonton Inlet, November 2010. And here's Polaris, J28, also gone. Born 1992 or 93, like in the early part of 93 maybe. And again, and this is with her daughter, J46, who is, I think, 7 years old now. Very distinctive, very easy to identify her from a distance with that big neck in her dorsal. And her very young son, J54 Dipper, with his big sister and with J35. He, of course, didn't make it after his mom died. And this was just after his mom, J28 Polaris, died. And here he's being held up in very, very dire straits. probably not being fed, and was very close to succumbing right then, but being supported by Big Brother and by, I believe, a cousin. And J14, Samish. I kind of grew up with her. She was out there when I was out there. Everybody who's been out with J-Pod knows J14 Samish. Here she is with her daughter, J57. With a good shot, it looks like a generic sort of saddle patch, but there were certain scratches that were just so unique. You got to know them after looking at the photos enough times. And here's L95, Nigel, kind of in that same position that J1 was and that L87 is now. This was fairly brief, but we traveled with her a lot. That's coming out of Admiralty. This is how we saw them. This is sort of just to give you a sense of how people who either go out in boats or see them from shore see them, how we experience them with their families usually. And this is kind of a sad shot because this shows the satellite tag on L95, which a few weeks later, his carcass was found out on the west side of Vancouver Island and had died of a fungal infection that was traced to the wound left by that satellite tag. And that effectively ended the satellite tagging of southern residents. Certainly since then, and I don't know if it'll ever start up again. Sort of a case of you love the data, but you hate the method. And little J55. And the 3 unnamed calves. And this is where it gets kind of intriguing because in January, J31 Suchi was pushing a deceased neonate, presumably her own. A newborn, whether it had been born live or not, is not known, but for hours, just pushing this little neonate around. And then there was the neonate found near Suit on BC that by genetics was shown to be a southern resident. And in May 2016, K27 was carrying her premature calf. 2 in 2016 that were carrying their newborns or prematures, which gives you a sense of the attachment, a sense of the grief, a sense of what they may go through. And this is a photo that shows K27 deadhead with that fetus. It was not full term because it was too small. It was only 3 or 4 feet long. They're born at 7 or 8 feet. But it was a miniature. It was a perfect little calf. And she pushed it around all day, at least. And then this goes back to 2010, L72. And here's just a little note by Robin Baird of Cascadia Research. This morning we encountered L72 and her 6-year-old son L105 Fluke. She was carrying a dead calf on the west side of San Juan Island for at least 6 hours during the time that they saw. And when they left, she was still pushing the little calf around. And there's another story that I'd like to tell that's really interesting, and I think it really goes to that response to losing a calf. It doesn't explain it, this is just an observation, but it's by Astrid Van Vinken, who, whether you know or not, is a double PhD in computer sciences, who was research director at the Center for Whale Research for many years, I think 8 years, and is from the Netherlands. And she also wrote a beautiful novel about orcas from the point of view of the orcas, most of it, as if she is one of them. She really did that mental exercise and wrote an entire novel based on that. It's called Togetherness is Our Home. A gray day in Norway. It was dark and gray when we set out. We soon sighted whales, and I cheered as I saw a male push a little orange calf to the surface. It took a few minutes for us to realize that the male was pushing a little dead calf. And I'm going to show some beautiful photos of orcas in Norway, not from this story, but just to sort of illustrate this story as we go. It was a sad sight. The orca was accompanied by 3 females and a juvenile. They were close together and moved slowly. I felt I was witnessing mourning orcas, sharing their grief over the loss of their little family member. Quietly we saw the male surface, and at times we saw him push the calf in front of him. The other whale swam at his side. We watched them, hardly moving, to see what happened. The whales started to spy hop around us. They made no clear attempt to leave us. One moment, one of the females spy hopped, and she was immediately followed by the male. When he rose up, we saw the little calf slip away from his rostrum and slide back into the water. The whales spy hopped many times, and in one instant, 2 females spy hopped simultaneously. A little later, 2 other females joined, and the male and female started to leave the group. The remaining whales made several surfacings and turns in unison, several whales breaking the surface simultaneously. They formed almost a circle with heads turned inwards. Then, after 1 or 2 dives, they suddenly lined up again and surfaced in one row. Again, the whales came close together and were all directed to something in the center. Suddenly, the little dead baby orca was visible in a flash. Apparently, the whales were around the little calf and taking part in a mutual activity of nudging the little baby. We had the feeling we were witnessing something that seemed to be some sort of ritual. Several hours later, the whales broke up into several groups. We can't know how they felt, what they were going through, what that was really about. We don't even empathize with each other very well. So how can we even start? Well, I think if we look at some of the clues, some of the natural history that we do know, as Mike pointed out this morning, orca's evolutionary history is very, very long, about 10 million years. And for most of that, they were in their current size, presumably, from the fossil record, and presumably including their cranial capacity. Of course, they are the largest of the dolphins, but the adult orca brain at over 5 kilograms is almost 5 times larger than ours. And in fact, according to the work of Sam Ridgway and his group, maybe even larger than the sperm whale brains, which would make them the largest brains on Earth. And those brains are not simple. They have this extra load, this paralimbic load that we don't have, which is thought to sort of unify sensations and emotions. And their brains are rich in what are called spindle neurons. which, because they seem to sort of enhance emotional intelligence and empathy. But now they're found in several other species, but they're very rich in orcas. And they have a lot of elaboration or jurifications in the brain, a lot of folds, a lot of surface area, which is believed to be an indication of intelligence. So that just suggests they're doing something very sophisticated, very complex with those big brains. And their psychology, at least as we see it expressed in their movements and their family affiliations, are just beyond anything we know in nature in terms of their cohesion, their attentiveness, their constant consciousness of each other. And of course, it's good to know there's no dispersion. You're born in, you stay, you were raised in your family. And even transients, which of course didn't used to be in very large groups, and still it's rare and it's temporary when the natural lines get together, like yesterday when there were 24 of them. That's a big, large group for transients. It used to be unheard of. But the rule is that they travel in small groups, 3, 4, or 5, usually at a time. But that doesn't mean that they're fragmented. It doesn't mean that those individuals in that group, that's a hunting group, they're stealthy. They sneak up on seals and sea lions and porpoise. So they don't really lose touch with each other. They don't really spread out. You're born in, you stay in. And they have been shown, dolphins have been shown to understand symbolic symbols, basically signs, the kind of language that they can learn quickly and easily and use. And I think it's also important to consider they've had no predators for millions of years in their evolutionary history. We can't say that. And it wasn't that long ago, we were not the top predator. We had a lot to worry about. A lot of big-toothed cats and dogs and just a lot of things that could bite us or take us down. We had to be very careful. They've never had to be careful. Not only are they big, with really big teeth, but they've got each other's backs. They cooperate, communicate, coordinate, and you just can't sneak up on an orca. And in all that time, as Gabe so well pointed out, they've shown no aggression toward humans. That's a rule. It's a taboo that they just don't break except when they're suffering extreme stress in captivity. And I find it also intriguing. I haven't seen anything published on this, but the population estimates worldwide for orcas, and they are the only large mammal that goes everywhere in the oceans. 70% of the earth, and there are orcas living in the tropics, deep water. They're more abundant in the cold, polar seas, but they're found everywhere and they can adapt to anywhere. And yet there are only, when you add up what is known, the communities that are known, they tend to be each community in the low hundreds, 200 or 300. And so, there is no firm global estimate, but there can't be more than about 20,000 worldwide, 20 or 30,000. Most of them are in the earthy bits of Antarctica and are, very hard to access and do any field work on. So there's nothing firm. But, you think that they might grow to much larger populations and put much more stress on the carrying capacity of their habitats. And maybe they did at some time in their distant evolutionary history, or maybe they are conscious of that. Maybe they control their populations. And I just want to give this quote I give almost every time I give a talk, but I think it is that much of a landmark revelation. And this was a paper published in 2001 by Rendell and Whitehead called Culture in Whales and Dolphins, where they say, right there in the abstract, the complex and stable vocal and behavioral cultures of sympatric groups of killer whales, Orcas Orca, appear to have no parallel outside humans. So orcas are like us more than they are like any other animal out there. I mean, there may be some that are not studied, other cetaceans most likely. Pilot whales are known to be similar. Sperm whales have cultures. We know a lot of these things, but that's a remarkable statement, and it really hasn't been followed up. So this is all very new. Historically, all animals have been pretty scary, pretty intimidating to humans. And we haven't been the top predator until recently. They challenge our authority as the top dog in nature. So we've always sort of vilified them and persecuted them and sometimes tried to exterminate them. So we're learning not to. We're learning restraint. We're learning some understanding and some empathy. And part of that is sharing their grief, sharing their losses. And we're learning to do that. I think this is a big turn for humans to be able to do this. Because the orcas are non-human persons, which I grant them that, and that lawsuit in 2011 against SeaWorld for slavery certainly tried to make that point. And perceptions of reality develop in a web of interpersonal relationships and interactions, interwoven with social and ecological and cultural influences, like Kay Bradshaw pointed out. Then their minds and their sense of self and how and what they see are formed and informed continually by their family members. And that, I think, is a really important insight into them. There are some stories. I think we pretty well got to move on here. But stories that illustrate how they gain trust with each other, how they build trust, how they test trust. And they probably do that invisibly to us, and to orcas that grow up in the same pod don't need to do that much anymore. They may do it already by sharing their prey, by cooperating to catch more. But when there are captive orcas and there are humans around, there have been many, many stories from when SeaWorld had a tank where they kept their whales when they weren't on the display, and so they, without any supervision, this is back in the late 60s, and so some people were able to go in there and just interact with no conditions, no training, no rules, almost no supervision, really. And there are really interesting stories about the orcas holding on to their hand and pulling just a little bit, and then letting that happen until it got to where it kind of hurt and they were about to get pulled in, and so they resisted a little bit and the whales got it. Okay, that's the limit. That's how far we can go. And so after that, not only did they observe that limit that they had learned, but they taught the others. So others that were novices to that would come in and observe those same limits. Paul Spong talks about the same thing with Skana when he was first up at Vancouver Aquarium. And Skana would come by and kind of brush his foot, and he would yank his foot out of the pool. And gradually, Skana would come in closer, and Paul learned not to do that. And gradually, Skana was able to show Paul, you can trust me. You have to trust me. And he would come there and just maybe, put a loose grasp on his foot, but nothing occurred. And something I just learned, Jeff Renner, the former weather person of King 5 TV, swam with Miracle, the whale that was captive at Victoria, way back in 1977, and had the same kind of thing. He was actually in the water diving, and Miracle grabbed his arm very gently and pulled him around. And didn't hurt him, but sort of kept that eye contact. And Jeff knew it was safe. He felt it was safe. But it was a way of kind of building trust. So, we can't know how they feel, and I'm not coming to any conclusions here, but I think it really behooves us to try to figure that out. How do they feel their grief? How much can we empathize with them? And try to dig deep and really visualize and empathize with the girls. That's really as much as I've got time for and as much as I've got. So I appreciate your time.